Chapter 13. One story I will try to reproduce, but alas, it is like trying to reconstruct a forest out of broken branches and withered leaves. In the fairy book, everything was just as it should be, though whether in words or something else, I cannot tell. It glowed and flashed the thoughts upon the soul with such a power that the medium disappeared from the consciousness, and it was occupied only with the things themselves. My representation of it must resemble a translation from a rich and powerful language, capable of embodying the thoughts of a splendidly developed people into the meager and half-articulate speech of a savage tribe. Of course, while I read it, I was Cosmo, and his history was mine. Yet, all the time I seemed to have a kind of double consciousness, and the story a double meaning. Sometimes it seemed only to represent a simple story of ordinary life, perhaps almost a universal life, wherein two souls, loving each other and longing to come nearer, do, after all, but behold each other in a glass, darkly. As through the hard rock go the branching silver veins, as into the solid land run the creeks and gulfs from the unresting sea, as the lights and influences of the upper world sink silently through the earth's atmospheres, so doth fairy invade the world of men, and sometimes startle the common eye with an association as of cause and effect, when between the two no connecting links can be traced. Cosmo von Verstal was a student of the University of Prague. Though of a noble family, he was poor, and prided himself upon the independence that poverty gives, for what will not a man pride himself upon when he cannot get rid of it? A favorite with his fellow students, he had had no companions, and none of them had ever crossed the threshold of his lodging in the top of one of the highest houses in the old town. Indeed, the secret of much of that complacence which recommended him to his fellows was the thought of his unknown retreat, whether in the evening he could betake himself and indulge undisturbed in his own studies and reveries. These studies, besides those subjects necessary to his course at the university, embraced some less commonly known and approved, for in a secret drawer lay the works of Albert, Magnus, and Cornelius Agrippa, along with others less read and more abstruse. As yet, however, he had followed these researches only from curiosity, and had turned them to no practical purpose. His lodging consisted of one large, low-ceiled room, singularly bare of furniture, for besides a couple of wooden chairs, a couch which served for dreaming on both by day and night, and a great press of black oak, there was very little in the room that could be called furniture. But curious instruments were heaped in the corners, and one stood a skeleton, half leaning against the wall, half supported by a string about its neck. One of its hands, all of its fingers, rested on the heavy pommel of a greatsword that stood beside it. Various weapons were scattered about over the floor. The walls were utterly bare of adornment, for the few strange things such as a large dried bat with wings dispread, the skin of a porcupine, and a stuffed sea mouse, could hardly be reckoned as such. But although his fancy delighted in vagaries like these, he indulged his imagination in far different fare. His mind had never yet been filled with an absorbing fashion, but it lay like a still twilight open to any wind, whether the low breath that wafts but odors, or the storm that bows the great trees till they strain and creak. He saw everything as through a rose-colored glass. When he looked from his window on the street below, not a maiden passed but she moved as in a story, and drew his thoughts after her till she disappeared into the vista. When he walked in the streets, he always felt as if reading a tale, into which he sought to weave every face of interest that went by, and every sweet voice swept his soul as with the wing of a passing angel. He was in fact a poet without words, the more absorbed and endangered that the springing waters were dammed back into souls where, finding no utterance, they grew, and swelled, and undermined. He used to lie on his hard couch and read a tale or a poem, till the book dropped from his hand. But he dreamed on. He knew not whether wake or sleep, until the opposite roof grew upon his sense, and turned golden in the sunrise. Then he arose too, and the impulses of vigorous youth kept him ever active, either in study or in sport, until again the close of the day left him free, and the world of night, which had lain drowned in the cataract of the day, rose up in his soul, with all its stars and dim-seen phantom shapes. But this could hardly last long. Some one form must sooner or later step within the charmed circle, enter the house of life and compel the bewildered magician to kneel and worship. One afternoon, towards dusk, he was wandering dreamily in one of the principal streets, when a fellow student roused him by a slap on the shoulder and asked him to accompany him into a little back alley to look at some old armor which he had taken a fancy to possess. Cosmo was considered an authority in every matter pertaining to arms, ancient or modern, and the use of weapons. None of the students could come near him, and his practical acquaintance with some had principally contributed to establish his authority to reference to all. He accompanied him willingly. They entered a narrow alley, and thence a dirty little court where a low arched door admitted them into a heterogeneous assemblage of everything musty and dusty and old that could well be imagined. His verdict on the armor was satisfactory, and his companion at once concluded the purchase. As they were leaving the place, Cosmo's eye was attracted by an old mirror of an elliptical shape which leaned against the wall, covered with dust. Around it was some curious carving, which you could see but very indistinctly by the glimmering light which the owner of the shop carried in his hand. It was this carving that attracted his attention, at least so it appeared to him. He left the place, however, with his friend, taking no further notice of it. They walked together to the main street, where they parted and took opposite directions. No sooner was Cosmo left alone than the thought of the curious old mirror returned to him. A strong desire to see it more plainly arose within him, and he directed his steps once more towards the shop. The owner opened the door when he knocked, as if he had expected him. He was a little, old, withered man with a hooked nose and burning eyes, constantly in a slow, restless motion, and looking here and there as if something had eluded them. Pretending to examine several other articles, Cosmo at last approached the mirror, requested to have it taken down. "Take it down yourself, master. I cannot reach it," said the old man. Cosmo took it down carefully. When he saw that the carving was indeed delicate and costly, being both of admirable design and execution, containing withal many devices which seemed to embody some meaning to which he had no clue, this, naturally, in one of his taste and temperament, increased the interest he felt in the old mirror, so much, indeed, that he now longed to possess it, in order to study its frame at his leisure. He pretended, however, to want it only for use, and saying he feared the plate could be of little service, as it was rather old, he brushed away a little of the dust from his face, expecting to see a dull reflection within. His surprise was great when he found the reflection brilliant, revealing a glass not only uninjured by age, but wondrously clear and perfect, even for one newly from the hands of the maker. He asked carelessly what the owner wanted for the thing. The old man replied by mentioning a sum of money far beyond the reach of poor Cosmo, who proceeded to replace the mirror where it had stood before. "You think the price too high," said the old man. "I do not know that it is too much for you to ask," replied Cosmo, "but it is far too much for me to give." The old man held up his light towards Cosmo's face. "I like your look," said he. Cosmo could not return the compliment. In fact, now he looked closely at him for the first time, he felt a kind of repugnance to him, mingled with a strange feeling of doubt whether a man or woman stood before him. "What is your name?" he continued. "Cosmo von Verstal." Ah, I thought as much. I see your father in you. I knew your father very well, young sir. I dare say, in some odd corners of my house, you might find some old things with his crest and cipher upon them still. Well, I like you. You shall have the mirror at the fourth part of what I asked for it, but upon one condition." "What is that?" said Cosmo, for although the price was still a great deal for him to give, he could just manage it, and the desire to possess the mirror had increased to an altogether uncountable degree, since it had seen beyond his reach. "That if you should ever want to get rid of it again, you let me have the first offer." "Certainly," replied Cosmo with a smile, adding a moderate condition indeed. "On your honor?" insisted the seller. "On my honor," said the buyer, and the bargain was concluded. "I will carry it home for you," said the old man, as Cosmo took it in his hands. No, I will carry it myself," said he, for he had a peculiar dislike to revealing his residence to anyone, and more especially to this person, to whom he felt every moment a greater antipathy. "Just as you please," said the old creature, muttered to himself as he held his light at the door to show him out of the court. "Sold for the 6th time. I wonder what will be the upshot of it this time. I should think my lady had enough of it by now. Cosmo carried his prize carefully home, but all the way he had an uncomfortable feeling that he was watched and dogged. Repeatedly he looked about, but saw nothing to justify his suspicions. Indeed, the streets were too crowded and too ill-lighted to expose very readily a careful spy, if such there should be at his heels. He reached his lodging in safety, and leaned his purchase against the wall, rather relieved, strong as he was, to be rid of its weight. Then, lighting his pipe, threw himself on the couch, and was soon lapped in the folds of one of his haunting dreams. He returned home earlier than usual the next day, and fixed the mirror to the wall, over the hearth at one end of his long room. He then carefully wiped away the dust from its face, and clear as the water of a sunny spring, the mirror shone out from beneath the envious covering. But his interest was chiefly occupied with the curious carving of the frame. This he cleaned as well as he could with a brush, and then he proceeded to a minute examination of its various parts, in the hope of discovering some index to the intention of the carver. In this, however, he was unsuccessful, and at length, pausing with some weariness and disappointment, he gazed vacantly for a few moments into the depth of the reflected room. "But, ere long," he said, half aloud, "what a strange thing a mirror is, and what a wondrous affinity exists between it and a man's imagination. For this room of mine, as I beheld it in the glass, is the same, and yet not the same. It is not the mere representation of the room I live in. It looks just as if I were reading about it in the story I like. All its commonness has disappeared. The mirror has lifted out of the region of fact into the realm of art, and the very representing of it to me has clothed with interest that which was otherwise hard and bare, just as one sees with delight upon the stage the representation of a character from which one would escape in life as from something unendurably wearisome. But is it not rather that art rescues nature from the weary and sated regards of our senses, the degrading injustice of our anxious everyday life, and, appealing to the imagination which dwells apart, reveals nature some degree as she really is, and as she represents herself to the eye of the child, whose everyday life, fearless and unambitions, meets the true import of the wonder-teeming world around him, and rejoices therein without questioning? That skeleton now, I almost fear it, standing there so still, with eyes only for the unseen, like a watchtower looking across all the waste of this busy world into the quiet regions of rest beyond. And yet I know every bone and every joint in it as well as my own fist, and that old battle-axe looks as if any moment it might be caught up by a mailed hand, and borne forth by the mighty arm, go crashing through casque and skull and brain, invading the unknown with yet another bewildered ghost. I should like to live in that room if I could only get into it." Scarcely had the half-molded words floated from him as he stood gazing into the mirror, when, striking him as with a flash of amazement that fixed him in his posture, noiseless and unannounced, glided suddenly through the door into his reflected room, with stately motion yet reluctant and faltering step, the graceful form of a woman, clothed all in white. Her back only was visible as she walked slowly up to the couch in the further end of the room, on which she laid herself wearily, turning towards him a face of unutterable loveliness, which suffering and dislike and a sense of compulsion strangely mingled with the beauty. He stood without the power of motion for some moments, with his eyes irrecoverably fixed upon her, and even after he was conscious of the ability to move, he could not summon up the courage to turn and look on her face to face in the veritable chamber in which he stood. At length, with a sudden effort in which the exercise of will was so pure that it seemed involuntary, he turned his face to the couch. It was vacant. In bewilderment mingled with terror, he turned again to the mirror. There, on the reflected couch, lay the exquisite lady form. She lay with closed eyes, whence 2 large tears were just welling from beneath the veiling lids, still as death, save for the convulsive motion of her bosom. Cosmo himself could not have described what he felt. His emotions were a kind that destroyed consciousness, could never be clearly recalled. He could not help standing yet by the mirror, and keeping his eyes fixed on the lady, though he was painfully aware of his rudeness, and feared every moment that she would open hers and meet his fixed regard. But he was, ere long, a little relieved, for after a while her eyelids slowly rose, and her eyes remained uncovered, but unemployed for a time, and when at length they began to wander round the room as if languidly seeking to make some acquaintance with her environment, They were never directed towards him. It seemed nothing but what was in the mirror could affect her visions, and therefore, if she saw him at all, it could only be his back, which, of necessity, was turned towards her in the glass. The two figures in the mirror could not meet face to face, except he turned and looked at her present in the room, and, as she was not there, he concluded that if he were ever to turn towards the part in his room corresponding to that which she lay, his reflection would either be invisible to her altogether, or at least it must appear to her to gaze vacantly towards her, and no meeting of the eyes would produce the impression of spiritual proximity. By and by, her eyes fell upon the skeleton, and he saw her shudder and close them. She did not open them again, but signs of repugnance continued evident on her countenance. Cosmo would have removed the obnoxious thing at once, but he feared to decompose her yet more by the assertion of his presence when the act would involved. So he stood and watched her. The eyelids yet shrouded the eyes, as a caustic cased the jewels within. The troubled expression gradually faded from the countenance, leaving only a faint sorrow behind. The features settled into an unchanging expression of rest, and by these signs, and the slow regular motion of her breathing, Cosmo knew that she slept. He could now gaze on her without embarrassment. He saw that her figure, dressed in the simplest robe of white, was worthy of her face, and so harmonious that either delicate molded foot or any finger of the equally delicate hand was an index to the whole. As she lay, her whole form manifested the relaxation of perfect repose. He gazed till he was weary, and at last seated himself near the new-found shrine and mechanically took up a book, like one who watches by his sick-bed. But his eyes gathered no thoughts from the page before him. His intellect had been stunned by the bold contradiction to its face of all its experience, and now lay passive without assertion or speculation, or even conscious astonishment, while his imagination sent one wild dream of blessedness after another coursing through his soul. How long he sat he knew not, but at length he roused himself, rose, and, trembling in every portion of his frame, looked again into the mirror. She was gone. The mirror reflected faithfully what his room represented, and nothing more. It stood there like a golden setting whence the central jewel had been stolen away, like a night sky without a glory of its stars. She had carried with her all the strangeness of the reflected room. It had sunk to the level of the one without.